From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, thanks again for joining us today to celebrate the birthday of a very special writer, Flannery O'Connor. My name is Anya Kreitney, and I'm the program specialist of the Poetry and Literature Center at the Library of Congress. I'm also a proud partner in this series, representing and celebrating the careers of many of our most valuable literary voices. I'm especially happy today as this event, Flannery O'Connor's literary birthday celebration, has been 2 years in the making. The event was originally slated for last year, and due to scheduling conflicts, we initially abandoned our concept of celebrating Flannery, but ultimately, genuine curiosity and admiration of O'Connor kept Flannery in our minds. So it is with this unique pleasure that I welcome our participants, Emily Mitchell and Bonnie Jo Campbell, here today. Before sharing a little bit about the organization of today's program, I just want to tell you a little bit about our authors. Bonnie Jo Campbell is the author of 2 novels, Once Upon a River, a national bestseller, and Q Road. Her critically acclaimed short fiction collections include American Salvage, Women and Other Animals, and most recently, Mothers Tell Your Daughters, published in the fall of 2015, and also on sale in the back. Emily Mitchell's debut novel, The Last Summer of the World, was published by Norton in 2007 and was a finalist for the New York Public Library Young Lions Award. Her first collection of short stories, Viral, was published in June 2015 and was described by the New York Times Book Review as, quote, alluring, the best stories here push toward true heartbreak, end quote. Emily teaches locally at the University of Maryland. And now, just for a little event breakdown, so you all are with us, each writer will lecture for approximately 20 minutes, and both will conclude by sharing excerpts of her work. Afterward, we will break slightly with tradition, and both authors will take questions from the audience after their reading, so be thinking or notating your questions during their lecture. And lastly, before I turn it over, I just want to remind everyone to turn off their cell phones or anything that would interrupt with today's programming. And let me also remind you that the Poetry and Literature Center puts on 30 to 40 public programs just like this one every year. So if you're interested to find more out about this particular series or others, please put your name on our email list in the back of the room. And without further ado, you guys will help me welcome our writers. And first up is Emily Mitchell, followed by Bonnie Jo Campbell. Thank you.
Gosh, thank you to Anya for that lovely introduction. I'm so pleased and a little daunted to be here today. In Flannery O'Connor's story, A Late Encounter with the Enemy, the reader meets General Tennessee Flint Rock Sash, a 104-year-old Confederate veteran, and the 64-year-old granddaughter with whom he lives, Sally Poker Sash. Thank you. General Sash, we learn, was in fact not a general in the Civil War or in any other war. He acquired his much-admired uniform as part of the promotional pageantry for a movie premiere just 12 years earlier. Now, in the narrative present of the story, the wheelchair-bound general is attending Sally Poker's belated graduation from teaching college. He has been left in the care of a young boy called John Wesley, who has been tasked to bring him up onto the stage for the ceremony. The graduates in their heavy robes looked as if the last beads of ignorance were being sweated out of them. The sun blazed off the fenders of automobiles and beat from the columns of buildings and pulled the eye from one spot of glare to another. It pulled Sally Pokers towards the big red Coca-Cola machine that had been set up by the side of the auditorium. Here she saw the general parked, scowling and hatless, in his chair in the blazing sun, while John Wesley, his blouse loose behind, his hip and cheek pressed to the red machine, was drinking a Coca-Cola. She broke from the line and galloped to them and snatched the bottle away. She shook the boy and thrust in his blouse and put the hat on the old man's head. "Now get him in there," she said, pointing one rigid finger to the side door of the building. For his part, the general felt as if there were a little hole beginning to develop and widen in the top of his head. The boy wheeled him rapidly down a walk and up a ramp and into a building and bumped him over the stage entrance and into position where he had been told, and the general glared in front of him at heads that all seemed to flow together and eyes that moved from one face to another. Several figures in black robes came and picked up his hand and shook it. A black procession was following up each aisle and forming to stately music in a pool in front of him. The music seemed to be entering his head through the little hole, and he thought for a second that the procession would try to enter it too. He didn't know what procession this was, but there was something familiar about it. It must be familiar to him since it had come to meet him, and he didn't like a black procession. In any procession that came to meet him, he thought irritably, ought to have floats with beautiful girls on them, like the floats before the Primi. It must be something connected with history, like they were always having. He had no use for any of it. What happened then wasn't anything to a man living now, and he was living now. When all the procession had flowed into the black pool, a black figure began orating in front of it. The figure was telling something about history, and the general made up his mind he wouldn't listen, but the words kept seeping through the little hole in his head. He heard his own name mentioned, and his chair was shuttled forward roughly, and the Boy Scout took a big bow. They called his name, and the fat brat bowed. "God damn you," the old man tried to say. "Get out of my way, I can stand up." But he was jerked back again, and before he could get up and take his bow, he supposed the noise they made was for him. If he was over, he didn't intend to listen to any more of it. If it hadn't been for the little hole in the top of his head, none of the words would have gotten to him. He thought of putting a finger up there into the hole to block them, but the hole was a little wider than his finger, and it felt as if it was getting deeper. Another black robe had taken the place of the first one and was talking now, and he heard his name mentioned again, but they were not talking about him, they were still talking about history. "If we forget our past," the speaker was saying, "we won't remember our future, and it will be as well, for we won't have one." The general heard some of these words gradually. He had forgotten history, and he didn't intend to remember it again. He had forgotten the name and face of his wife, and the names and faces of his children, or even if he had a wife and children, and he had forgotten the names and the places themselves, and what had happened at them. He was considerably irked by the hole in his head. He had not expected to have a hole in his head at this event. It was the slow black music that had put it there, and though most of the music had stopped outside, there was still a little of it in the hole, going deeper and moving around in his thoughts, letting the words he heard into the dark places of his brain. He had heard the words Chickamauga, Shiloh, Johnston, Lee, and he knew he was inspiring all these words that meant nothing to him. He wondered if he had been a general at Chickamauga or at Lee. Then he tried to see himself and the horse mounted in the middle of a float full of beautiful girls being driven slowly through downtown Atlanta. Instead, the old words began to stir in his head as if they were trying to wrench themselves out of place and come to life. The speaker was through with that war and had gone on to the next one. And now he was approaching another, and all his words, like the black procession, were vaguely familiar and irritating. There was a long finger of music in the general's head, probing various spots that were words, letting in a little light on the words and helping them to live. The words began to come towards him, and he said, "Damn it, I ain't gonna have it." and he started edging backwards to get out of the way. Then he saw the figure in the black robe sit down, and there was a noise, and the black pool in front of him began to rumble and to flow towards him from either side like the black, slow music, and he said, "Stop, damn it, I can't do but one thing at a time." He couldn't protect himself from the words and attend to the procession too, and the words were coming at him fast. He felt that he was running backwards, and the words were coming at him like musket fire, just escaping him, but getting nearer and nearer. He turned around and began to run as fast as he could, but he found himself running towards the words. He was running into a regular volley of them and meeting them with quick curses. As the music swelled towards him, the entire past opened up on him out of nowhere, and he felt his body riddled in 100 places with the sharp stabs of pain, and he fell down, returning a curse for every hit. He saw his wife's narrow face looking at him critically through her round gold-framed glasses. He saw one of his squinting, bald-headed sons and his mother run towards him with an anxious look, then a succession of places, Chickamauga, Shiloh, Marthasville, rush at him as if the past were the only future now and he had to endure it. Then, suddenly, he saw that the black procession was almost on him. He recognized it, for it had been dogging him all his days. He made a desperate effort to see over it and find out what comes after the past, and he made such a desperate effort to see over it and find out what comes after the past that his hand clenched the sword until the blade touched bone. The graduates were crossing the stage in a long file to receive their scrolls and shake the president's hand. As Sally Poker was near the end, crossed, she glanced at the general and saw him sitting fixed and fierce, his eyes wide open, and she turned her head forward again and held it a perceptible degree higher and received her scroll. Once it was over, and she was out of the auditorium and in the sun again, she located her kin, and they waited together on the bench in the shade for John Wesley to wheel the old man out. That crafty scout had bumped him out the back way and rolled him at high speed down a flagstone path and was waiting now with the corpse in the long line at the Coca-Cola machine. As I said, I'm pleased and a little daunted to be here today. I'm by no means an expert on Flannery O'Connor, and I'm certain that there are people here listening who know a great deal more about her life and works than I do. But what I am is somebody who writes short stories and aspires to write them well, and in that capacity, I want to talk a little bit about O'Connor and what her work means to me. The passage I just read exemplifies some of the aspects of her work that I admire the most and that I found the most valuable to my own development as a writer. O'Connor is justly known as a writer who evokes with tremendous precision the conventions and manners of her own time and place, but she's also, I think, a great writer of ghost stories. She is a great observer and chronicler of the ways in which human beings, and perhaps American human beings especially, are haunted. We are haunted by the past, and we are haunted by those aspects of the world that we are least happy to acknowledge and quickest to deny. And this haunting is only intensified and perhaps is even caused by our concerted efforts to escape, to be reborn and renewed, to transcend, to overcome by an act of personal determination. The more we insist that we have moved on, that we are, as General Sash puts it, living now, the more what we wish to deny dogs us. O'Connor's characters draw to themselves the very things that they dread the most, the people and events which disrupt their comfortable assumptions. And in O'Connor's view, of course, such disruption is precisely what we need in order that we might have the possibility of experiencing grace. I first came across O'Connor's stories and essays in college, and I found in her uncompromising depictions the permission that I needed to pursue my own fledgling fiction. I learned from her that your characters need not be likable to be fascinating, that the purpose of a story is to reveal and not necessarily to resolve. I learned that the meaning of a story must be, to use O'Connor's words, experienced meaning. A story, she says, is a way to say something that can't be said any other way. I learned that a story must grow its own meaning over the course of its unfolding, the characters and the objects in the story accumulating meaning from the action of the story itself. But most importantly, I learned that the boundary between the present and the past is very thin indeed, and sometimes it disintegrates altogether. So I'm going to finish with a short story from my first collection that I think owes its existence to O'Connor in this respect. It's called A Boy My Sister Dated in High School. A boy my sister dated in high school slapped her across the face during an argument. They were sitting in the front seat of his car, parked by the basketball court behind our house, and she made a sarcastic reply to something he had said, and before she knew what was happening, he'd raised his hand and swung it, open-palmed, against her cheek. She didn't tell me about this until years later, after we had both left home. When she did tell me, I felt at once angry and then strangely guilty because the boy in question was extraordinarily good-looking, and I remembered having been impressed in a shallow way that I never spoke about, that my sister was dating someone so handsome. I was jealous of a lot of things about my sister in those days, her beauty and her ease with people, how spontaneously funny she could be, how well she was liked. She fit in at our school and in our town, in her own body, in a way that I could not seem to manage, quiet and bookish and peculiar as I was then and remain. Still, there was never a time when I didn't love her very much and when I wouldn't have done whatever I could to support and defend her. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I asked when she finally did. When the boy she was dating hit my sister, it made a sharp cracking sound, just like it does in the movies. She raised her hand and touched the side of her own face. The expanse of skin where he'd struck her buzzed and tingled, felt weirdly alive. It didn't hurt, even the actual slap itself hadn't really hurt. Instead, she was shocked, surprised because she had not expected this, and then confused about what she should do next. She looked over at the boy she was dating who had just hit her. He was leaning way back away from her, against the car door, as if he was afraid, either of her or of what he had just done. In her eyes was an expression of shock and remorse much more intense than anything she herself seemed to be feeling. He too had been surprised, and he looked like he might be about to cry. At that moment, it came into her mind that maybe, in punishment for what he had done, the gods had magically frozen him in his current physical position, curled up like a frightened fetus with his eyes bugged out and his mouth hanging slightly open. Perhaps he would be stuck like that forever. In her mind, she envisioned having to explain to the boy's mother how her son had come to be paralyzed in this posture. He hit me, she would say, and then, well, now he doesn't seem to be able to move or speak. I'm sorry. She thought of him in various scenes over the course of his life to come, in school, at home, in church, still fixed in that attitude, and the absurdity of these images, together with the amazement she still felt at what had just occurred, made her suddenly snort with laughter. Her laughter seemed to free the boy from his paralysis. "Oh God," he said, "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean." He reached out towards her as though he wanted to take back what he'd done, but then he withdrew his hand. "I'm sorry," he said again. He hung his head. "I guess you should take me home," my sister said. Suddenly, she felt like crying. He nodded and started the car. When they pulled up in front of my parents' house, he turned off the engine. He looked over at her mournfully. She suddenly thought that he was making a huge self-centered melodrama out of something that really wasn't so important. He wanted to be a terrible, unforgivable villain, and she did not want to give him that satisfaction. "Look," she said, "I'm okay. It doesn't hurt. I'm not like scarred for life or anything." "Really?" he asked. Really, she said. She leaned over and kissed him on the cheek. He clasped her hands gratefully. They smiled at each other because that was what they were used to doing. When they smiled, it felt as if a moment before they had been drowning in some cold, unpleasant sea, and now they were back on solid ground, back in the world they knew. A wave of relief swept over them. You were being kind of a bitch, he said. I was, she conceded, and you were being a Class 1 a-hole. She opened the door and got out. Can I call you tomorrow? He said after her. Yes, she said, and went inside. She could hardly even feel where he had hit her anymore. Because they had made up and because she wasn't hurt, she didn't feel like she needed to mention to anyone what had happened. If she said anything to our mother, she thought she would only overreact. She would call the school and maybe the boys' parents. She would say things about violence against women and the patriarchy, the kind of embarrassing things that my sister had to do her best to ignore, so she would not be an outcast in the conservative suburb where we lived. If she told our mother and she started to make a fuss, it would definitely mean that she and the boy would break up and stop dating. They were both part of a big group of friends, and she did not want to cause problems in that group over something that was really, truly no big deal, but that might become a big deal if the parents were involved. It wasn't like she was some battered or abused woman like you saw on television talk shows or heard about on the local news. Probably in a few months, she wouldn't even remember that it had happened. So she said nothing, and the boy never did it again. And after a while, they broke up for unrelated reasons and started dating other people without much drama or distress to either of them. They finished high school, went on to different colleges. They didn't keep in touch. But during that time, unlike what she had expected, the memory of being hit by the boy didn't just fade away and vanish. It wasn't that she thought about it all the time, or that it ruined her life, or that she could never trust a man again, or anything like that, but from time to time it would come into her mind, that day, the moment of surprised confusion afterwards, and she came to feel, especially as she got a little older, that she had let herself down by the way she had reacted. This was the feeling that grew incrementally inside her. She should not have tried to make him feel better by telling him it was no big deal. She should not have kept it from their friends just so they could all continue to get along. From the beginning, she had failed to stand up for herself, and now she knew, or felt like she knew, about herself that she would let someone do that and do nothing about it. She would be obliging. She would comply. This guilt about how she hadn't stood up for herself was like a small stone that she had to carry around. That was how she pictured it, small and round but heavy. And she came to believe, she said, when she finally told me about it all those years later, that maybe if she told people about it, as she was doing now, it would get smaller and lighter, that sharing would diminish it, make it smaller, make it maybe even vanish. And I thought, but did not say, maybe, or maybe it will make it multiply. Thank you.
That was awesome. I never can figure out if it's the right with the glasses or without some middle age or something. Okay, when the Library of Congress asked me to talk about Flannery O'Connor, I shouted into the phone, "I'm unworthy," and I fanned myself with a very short story. And I'm not an academic. I said, I'm just a gal who loves stories and chickens and the work of Flannery O'Connor. And the truth is, when I think about Flannery O'Connor, I think about a barnyard fowl. And I will stand by my claim that each chicken is a unique individual. And I'm hoping someday to write a book about women and their birds. And in the essay called Flannery's Fowl, I will describe how she smuggled ducklings onto the airplane for the children of her friends, the Fitzgeralds, and how, as a kid, she taught a chicken to walk backwards. It was the high point of her life, she said decades later. She was wrong that nobody, wrong in saying that nobody would want to hear about her life in the future. A life lived, quote, between the house and the chicken yard, which I think is the name of a biography, a recent biography. She wrote an unsentimental essay called The King of the Birds about the arrogance and beauty of her peacocks. And she wrote a poem too. She sent a copy to her friend and said, "This is my first and last poem. I think poetry is a filthy habit for a fiction writer to get into." Let me read a little bit from The Displaced Person, which I think is the best depiction of the peculiar sort of farm life that Flannery knew so well, that was reflected in a lot of her stories. So this is from The Displaced Person. The peacock was following Mrs. Shortley up the road to the hill where she meant to stand. Moving one behind the other, they looked like a complete procession. Her arms were folded as she mounted the prominence. She might have been the giant wife of the countryside, come out at some sign of danger to see what the trouble was. She stood on two tremendous legs with the grand self-confidence of a mountain, and rose up narrowing bulges of granite to two icy blue points of light that pierced forward, surveying everything. She ignored the white afternoon sun, which was creeping behind a ragged wall of clouds as if it pretended to be an intruder, and cast her gaze down the red clay road that turned off from the highway. The peacock stopped just behind her. His tail, glittering green, gold, and blue in the sunlight, lifted just enough so that it would not touch the ground. It flowed out on either side like a floating train, and his head on the long blue reed-like neck was drawn back, as if his attention were fixed in the distance on something no one else could see. Mrs. Shortley was watching a black car turn through the gate from the highway. Over by the tool shed, about 15 feet away, two Negroes, Astor and Sulk, had stopped work to watch. They were hidden by a mulberry tree, but Mrs. Shortley knew they were there. Mrs. McIntyre was coming down the steps of her house to meet the car. She had on her largest smile, but Mrs. Shortley, even from her distance, could detect a nervous slide in it. These people who were coming were only hired help, like the Shortleys themselves, or like the Negroes. Yet here was the owner of the place out to welcome them. Here she was, wearing her best clothes and a string of beads, and now bounding forward with her mouth stretched. The car stopped at the walk just as she did, and the priest was the first to get out. He was a long-legged, black-suited old man with a white hat on and a collar that he wore backwards, which Mrs. Shortley knew was what priests did who wanted to be known as priests. It was this priest who had arranged for these people to come here. He opened the back door of the car and out jumped two children, a boy and a girl. And then, stepping more slowly, a woman in brown, shaped like a peanut. Then the front door opened and out stepped the man, the displaced person. He was short and a little sway-backed and wore gold-rimmed spectacles. Mrs. Shortley's vision narrowed on him and then widened to include the woman and the two children in a group picture. The first thing that struck her as very peculiar was that they looked like other people. Every time she had seen them in her imagination, the image she had got was of three bears walking single file with wooden shoes on like Dutchmen and sailor hats and bright coats with a lot of buttons. But the woman had on a dress she might have worn herself, and the children were dressed like anybody from around here. The man had on khaki pants and a blue shirt. Suddenly, as Mrs. McIntyre held out her hand to him, he bobbed down from the waist and kissed it. Mrs. Shortley jerked her own hand up toward her mouth, and then after a second brought it down and rubbed it vigorously on her seat. If Mr. Shortley had tried to kiss her hand, Mrs. McIntyre would have knocked him into the middle of next week. But then Mr. Shortley wouldn't have kissed her hand anyway. He didn't have time to mess around. Everybody in that story, the displaced person, can be judged by that last peacock that roams Mrs. McIntyre's farm. The priest, who is probably the most likable character Flannery ever wrote, is obsessed by its beauty. And this is a quote, this from the book. The priest let his eyes wander toward the birds. They had reached the middle of the lawn. The cock stopped suddenly, and curving his neck backwards, he raised his tail and spread it with a shimmering, timorous noise. Tears of small pregnant suns floated in a green-gold haze over his head. The priest stood transfixed, his jaw slack. Mrs. McIntyre wondered where she had ever seen such an idiotic old man. Christ will come like that, he said in a loud, gay voice, and wiped his hand over his mouth and stood there gaping. One of Mrs. McIntyre's black employees, who she calls only the old man, drives her crazy by talking to and reminiscing with the peacock. Meanwhile, she only tolerates the remaining cock because she fears her dead husband, the judge. Never in her 39 years of Flannery's life did she tire of watching her birds. Never did she tire of watching other people watch them. This from her essay. Some people are genuinely affected by the sight of a peacock, but do not care to admit it. Others appear to be incensed by it. Perhaps they have a suspicion that the bird has formed some unfavorable opinion of them. Flannery shows us that characters we love in fiction may be precisely the ones we would not want to spend time with in real life. She shows us that platitudes and cliches, these things we've always been taught to avoid, can make great writing. When Mrs. Hitchcock says, "There's no place like home," Hazel Motes replies, "You might as well go one place as another." And of course, Mrs. Hopewell says, "It takes all kinds to make the world." And Mrs. Hitchcock says, "How time flies." "Nothing is the way it used to be," says Mr. Shiflett when talking to the elder Lucy Nell Crater. Mrs. Freeman says, "Well, I wouldn't have said they was, and I wouldn't have said they wasn't." I'm just going to read a little section from Good Country People. We've just met Hulga, this sullen, one-legged, educated daughter, called here the girl. When Mrs. Hopewell said to Mrs. Freeman that life was like that, Mrs. Freeman would say, "I always said so myself." Nothing had been arrived at by anyone that had not been arrived at by her. When Mrs. Hopewell said to her after they had been on the place a while, you know you're the wheel behind the wheel," and winked. And Mrs. Freeman had said, "I know it. I've always been quick. It's some that are quicker than others." "Everybody is different," Mrs. Hopewell said. "Yes, most people is," Mrs. Freeman said. "It takes all kinds to make the world. I always said it did myself." The girl was used to this dialogue for breakfast and more of it for dinner. Sometimes they had it for supper, too. Flannery O'Connor said in her essay, Some Aspects of the Grotesque in Southern Fiction, "I think if there is any value in hearing writers talk, it will be in hearing what they can witness and not what they can theorize about." I traveled with Flannery on my recent book tour, or rather with a life-size two-dimensional foam board Flannery that I could carry in my station wagon to bookstores and college campuses. You can see there's picture. I have a Facebook page called Flannery Travels with Flannery. So, she remained upright and modestly dressed in hotels while I slept. She remained sober while I drank. On Sundays, she prayed without me. As in life, she did not suffer fools gladly and kept a stern expression and always kept her clothes on. I was planning to cut her into 5 pieces and carry her here in my luggage, but I just couldn't. In her brief life, Flannery wrote and published 2 books of stories that portrayed a gritty, strange aspect of Southern life, starting with The Good Man is Hard to Find, and she had 2 novels, starting with Wise Blood. Last March, I had 2 collections for myself. Mine detailing gritty, difficult lives in small Michigan towns, and I was also the author of 2 novels. I was having trouble finishing my 5th book. I was having lots of trouble And then I realized that it felt not only difficult, it felt wrong. That I had the opportunity to publish a third collection of stories and Flannery had not. And I think that's why I made the Flannery here. I felt like she needed another trip out. Nearly everything I want to say about the writing life, Flannery has said more precisely and more cleverly. She addresses the fears writers have about being labeled regional writers. The woods are full of regional writers, and it is the horror of every serious Southern writer that he will become one, she said. But she also said, the best American fiction has always been regional. In her essay, The Writer and His Country, she says simply, in the greatest fiction, the writer's moral sense coincides with his dramatic sense. And most impressively, she made it clear she intended to judge no writing contests. I don't know if you guys know that writers are always asked to judge them. She said something very Bartleby-esque. She said, that is not something I would care to do. I don't know if you can ever trust what fiction writers tell you. After all, we just make things up for a living. Flannery's always said her works were pure fabrication, but in studying her life, we draw natural lines between her life and her single mother, and her life with her single mother on a farm full of birds. Her brief dalliance with a textbook salesman, if not a Bible salesman. Her experience with a Polish refugee working on the farm. It is a lousy thing to do to a writer, gaping this way at her real life, but it is irresistible. I think it is perhaps our kind of pornography. Last year, The Guardian chose 10 books to represent the genre rural noir. Rural noir, Tom Bowman wrote, is a term used to describe dark, dangerous stories set in the countryside. He went on to say, if your book has an all-terrain vehicle chase or a fistfight over a deer rifle in the middle of a swamp, somebody is going to call it rural noir. Maybe some of you have watched 30 Rock, where they have that show, The Rural Juror. Yeah, I know. I think we should probably say country noir. That's better. The Guardian chose Flannery for the top 10, as well as James M. Cain, Larry Brown, and Daniel Woodrell. I'm thinking through an essay about the connection between the literature of the South and the literature of the Midwest, particularly that of the places like Michigan, where folks from the South came and settled to work in the auto plants in the last century. In the old days, we might have talked about the literary grotesque, and I wonder if maybe that's just what the rural noir is another word for that. Flannery proposes that the Southern writers were more interesting because the South lost the Civil War. The South had had its fall. And I kind of wonder if maybe the upper Midwest, the seat of American manufacturing and trade unions and that fabulous middle class we used to have, has had its own plunge, an economic fall from grace. Something we writers are asked to do in our hometowns is to visit book groups at well-appointed homes and talk to upper middle class, middle-aged ladies about our books over wine and artichoke and spinach dip. And there is a question I am always asked in one form or another, one that I will paraphrase for you here. Why do you write about such awful people? When a reader told Flannery that her stories left a bad taste in her mouth, Flannery replied, well, you weren't supposed to eat it. And maybe most famously, she said, the truth does not change according to our ability to stomach it emotionally. About her novel, Wise Blood, she said, I am not afraid that the book will be controversial. I'm afraid it will not be controversial. The publishers have not always helped promote a thoughtful reading of her work. I saw a cover of The Violent Bear It Away, and it had, as an italic subtitle, a vivid, obsessive novel of the depravity of the Deep South. Right on the cover. Today is Good Friday, and Flannery O'Connor was a devout and good Catholic. Communion with the body of Christ was not a metaphor for her. Flannery said that after stories were written and published, They didn't belong to the author anymore. They belonged to God. And maybe that's how she saw it. But how I see it is that her stories belong to all of us, Catholics and Hindus and heathens alike. And I hope that we can all agree on Good Friday at the end of the dark season that we can thank the Lord for Flannery O'Connor. I'm going to read from the title story of my book, just a piece of it from the middle. And this story from the book Mothers Tell Your Daughters. And this story is told from the point of view of a dominating old farm woman who has had a stroke and cannot talk. She is furious about her condition, and she is thinking hard at her sullen, overeducated daughter, a women's study professor, hoping that the ungrateful girl can read her mind. So you might say it was inspired by Flannery. So this is just a chunk out of the middle. It's one of these stories, nobody should have ever tried to write this story. Like, from the point of view of somebody laying in bed. I kind of want to stage it as a play now, just to be perverse. Oh, and one thing that poor Flannery does, maybe somebody asked a question. I want to write something about Flannery and sex and the lack of it. I don't know, because my books are all full of it, just in case. All the marbles, so this is all inside her head. All the men added together made the solid world. They were the marbles in the jar, and women were whatever sand or water or air claimed the space left between them. That's how I saw things as a young woman. That was my women's studies. Now I've come to know that women are like vodka poured over men who melt away like ice cubes. It was a man who broke my nose, bent it like it is now. I let you kids think that big paint gelding had kicked me again. Patchy Pete was that horse's name, black and white like a Holstein cow. I bought him for $200 and ended up selling him for $200 after a year of getting kicked and bitten and thrown. I would have dressed him out for dog food or fed him to you kids if he hadn't been so gorgeous. But a good-looking horse, like a good-looking man, can always find a place in somebody's stable. Men climbed into my bed after they fenced my pasture, after they messed with the furnace and changed the oil in my Chevy truck, and my Chevy truck and my Ford tractor. They climbed into my bed after their wives threw them out. We needed their help. There was so much work to do around here, and mostly they were nice. I'm still alive, if barely, and a lot of angry wives are long dead, including Bill Theroux's wife, who wore herself out bitching about me, if you want to know the truth of it. When I was a teenager, my friend Julia said one day, "We gotta look pretty." I shaved my legs for the first time, and it took a long while to stop the bleeding. Us and 2 other friends got hold of a 6-pack, though we didn't like the taste of beer. We carried the bottles to where some men lived and reclined on their couch, ankles crossed. We didn't know how to talk to men, so we just smiled, and silence hung above the bag of pretzels they brought out until the men started to laugh, until we laughed with them. They were older and muscular and smelled of smoke and solvents from the repair shops where they worked. One man had a glass eye. He said he'd been shot. When they popped it out, we were all possessed by a powerful desire to hold the blind thing in our hands. Julia touched it first and passed it around. She got pregnant right away, and the rest of us followed. And for a lot of years, we raised our children, fed our husbands, worked hard at low-paying jobs or at jobs that didn't pay at all, and learned just how tired a body could be. Those men took me by surprise, but I never looked back. I never stopped singing love songs. I never longed for a time before men. Men's machines still sing to me. Revving chainsaw, motorboat, log splitter, rototiller, leaf blower, generator humming, cordless drill, rattle trap tractor, power washer, hedge trimmer, biting grinder. Motorcycles with mufflers torn off, diesel trucks chugging in the driveway. You remember those men who came to me after a fishing trip up north and filled my wringer washer with smelt? Come out with us and play, men used to call, like tomcats, and out I went. That old wringer washer was never the same after all them fish. The men who came around never passed up an easy target, so they killed all the rabbits. I meant to sew a blanket from the soft skins to replace my own skin, which I imagined wadded up under the bed in my room, smeared with menstrual blood, stiff with sperm, stretched by pregnancy. For years I'd warmed myself in the borrowed skins of men. I was good at cutting pelts from flesh, muscle from bone. After partying all night, a passed out man might resemble a great cut of meat in my bed, or on the couch or floor, leathery bronze shoulders and a fish white behind. Men inhaled great swaths of oxygen, exhaled smoke and sweat, so sometimes I could scarcely catch my breath. I remember finding you and your brothers fishing through a man's wallet like grubby elves. Shoo, shoo, I said, and the men slept on. After your daddy left, I tried to raise you to know men and not to fear them, so you wouldn't be taken by surprise. I figured that if any of them bothered you, you would make a fuss. The way you made a fuss when I wanted you to get out of bed early and haul buckets of water from the creek when the pipes froze. Of course you were scared of your daddy. He was a fearsome man, and he scared me too. But you could have whined and glared at them other men, the way you did at your poor worn-out ma who tried to feed and clothe you with no money. How was I supposed to know there was trouble with the way they pulled you onto their laps if you never told me you didn't like it? It seemed to me like you were having fun when they said how pretty you were. You never were the kind of kid who smiled, so I couldn't tell. Thanks.
Thanks again, both of you. It was wonderful. So we're going to go ahead and open it up for questions. For those who have those burning, just raise your hand and we'll come around to you. Does anyone want to start us off? 1, 2, 3.
Can I just ask about Emily? Was your story a pushcart? Was it published in Pushcart? Or did you go like this?
As a video.
So shy. Was your story published in the Pushcart
No,
series? I read it somewhere.
no. Can you hear me okay? I think
Yeah.
that's. I think
Yeah,
there's
there's
a
a mic
microphone maybe
behind you.
behind.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Here, behind you. I'm going to grab it. Excuse me.
Is- I remember reading it.
Yeah, it was published in Guernica online, and then in my collection. So that if you've seen it, then you would have seen it there.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't have a collection.
No,
Maybe
I'm
you will
sure,
now.
I'm sure you saw it online if you did see it.
It's just, yeah, I did. I understood.
I know, and if you guys don't have questions, we'll just start quoting Flannery.
We can certainly do that. I mean, you can't really go wrong with her. So.
Yeah, and I can tell you that I got on the plane here. This book set off the detectors, and we could not figure out why. But they kept searching my luggage, and they said books never set off the detectors, but this couldn't make it through. So
It's amazing.
I love both of your presentations and your own stories are so Flannery O'Connor-ish. I love them. A good man is hard to find as a cliche that becomes pivotal. I love that you picked out the element of cliche for humor and horror. Who else does that? It's just, except maybe it sounds like you have a talent for weaving those together too. But I wonder if both of you talk about, we laugh out loud at the worst things with Flannery O'Connor. When that woman with the same hat dies on the bus, for example, or when in The Good Man It's Hard to Find, the misfit says she'd have been a good woman if they'd have been somebody to shoot her every day of her life. We laugh. It turns us into
First, we can say we love it. I mean, Flannery was famously funny, you know, and she told, apparently she was you know, I always read those letters and thought they were the definitive letters. Apparently not. Apparently many things were taken out of them. She was very famous for telling off-color jokes and racial jokes. And so she had a sense of humor that was definitely not politically correct. And it's funny, what I learned over time is that we read her differently than she was hoping we would read her, and because of the Catholicism. You know, she doesn't see dying as so bad, you know, as maybe we more earthbound folks do.
Yeah. I mean, I think, you know, it's also that, you know, that it's always seemed to me that one of her kind of great projects is to break us away from sentimentality, and that the combination of you know, I mean, I think it's interesting, you know, you say it turns us into horrible people. I mean, in a way, that's absolutely right, but in another way, when we're laughing at something that's just so kind of out there and, you know, and sort of outside the bounds of what we normally would want to acknowledge exists, we let go of our assumptions for a minute. And I feel like that's so important to her stories, to kind of get us to this place where the things we thought are no longer available to us in an easy way. You know, and we sort of see the characters going through that, and then as, you know, as readers, we go through it with them. So that's, I think that it's that combination of getting us to laugh at things where we're like, oh my God, I can't believe I'm finding this funny. And yet we do, right?
Yeah, and maybe it was something, I mean, she did feel that in her stories, she would have liked to have saved us all and turned us into Catholics. And I think she felt that we had to go somewhere very extreme in order to get to the place where we could be acted upon by her stories.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I mean, from time to time, I come across that in other writers' work. You know, the writer John LaRue. You know, there's a young short story writer called Suzanne Rebecca who also sort of do that. But it feels to me, and in both of those cases, that comes from Flannery O'Connor, right? That desire to take the reader to some place really, you know, sort of quite strange and very, very unnerving.
Well, thank you both. It was so illuminating, the talk. I was struck by both of you kind of alluding to the notion of the past. And I was thinking about Faulkner's quote that the past is never really dead and it's not even past. And I'm wondering in O'Connor's fiction, maybe in your own, why she seems to be so interested in people who are uncomfortable with the present, who are disrupted by, you know, in living in the present state that they're at.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think, you know, it does seem to me as though she's interested in maybe the way we kind of try to, you know, the discomfort. I mean, I'm just thinking about, you know, I'm just thinking about this as I'm talking, that the discomfort of the present maybe is related to the way we try to get away from the past and the way, you know, that we sort of don't really want to acknowledge that it's there and yet it's there anyway. So, you know, so in, you know, say, A Late Encounter with the Enemy, it's like the idea of the Coca-Cola machine, you know, sort of in this, you know, like in the midst of this like very kind of, you know, what comes across as this very somber event. And then it just seems to everybody, I mean, it seems so wrong that it's there, right, that it sort of clashes. So I don't know, does that seem, I mean, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure, and I do think that relates to that use of cliches, which is the response that you make when you actually don't want to take the situation anew. And even in that character Mrs. Freeman, who you can't even tell her a thing that she hasn't already heard of. I don't know how she's a little bit better than I do. But I also think it has something to do with the South. It has something to do with this, and you know, I'm no one to talk about the South, though I did hang out with hillbilly girls as a youth and smoked a lot with them and did other things with their brothers. Did I just say that at the library? Yeah. But in the, I think Flannery O'Connor would see that at the, kind of the downfall of the South. It has something to do with that, of always looking back. But yeah, that's a great observation. You should write a paper about that. That's everything about Flannery O'Connor makes me want to write a paper, though I'm not one to write papers, so if I could teach a class and assign my students to write all these papers, that would be really great.
This isn't a question really, but it's more, I'm hoping you could kind of, since you've probably been researching Flannery O'Connor, you could kind of fill in the gaps here. I remember a short story she wrote about a child going to a freak show and seeing what she called a hermaphrodite, I guess. But that brings to mind when you were talking about her being not sentimental and being objective and just observing and seeing how people react to these strange, grotesque kind of scenes. I don't even know what my question is. I was just wondering, do you remember that story? You could tell me more
I
about
can't remember, which story was that? It's not the river, is it?
the river?
I don't, because I know the river, I know the kid drowns at the end, they all do. The minute, it's heartbreaking. For a little while I couldn't read Flannery O'Connor, because it's like, okay, you see something cute, you know it's going down.
Right.
Some sweet kid. Yeah, well, I mean, that's absolutely a great place for her to be, at a freak show where everything is risen to where we're taken to a very extreme place. And I know,
Yeah, it allows the reader to kind of observe these things, otherwise I think they would probably hide their eyes, or they'd hide behind cliche or something, and ignore it or try to take it as best they could, but I don't know, just.
yeah, we could say she is the reigning queen of the unsentimental.
Yeah, I mean, I think that she also kind of helps you as a reader to cope with the sort of truly horrifying things in the work by setting them so beautifully. I mean, because, in preparation for this talk, I was reading, sort of back through her stories, reading A Good Man Is Hard to Find Again, and one of the things, among the sort of many things where I was staggered by how well she does, sort of every aspect of short fiction, she sets the human world, right? I mean, I think funny that the point about the way in which the characters rehearse cliche is so apt. But the natural world is not cliche, right? And so she gives you these kind of crystal clear, incredibly compelling descriptions of the setting, the places, the natural world, the sky, the number of brilliant ways she describes the sun in just that one collection is so stunning. And that somehow that allows you to, the sort of hideousness is set within this world that's very complicated, sort of that evokes a variety of feelings. I think that's like otherwise you couldn't handle it as a reader, like you would permanently be in the state you described, like I can't read these anymore, they're too hard. But there is also this beauty that surrounds it that like gives you some access to that, and helps you through, basically, I think.
What Emily just said is exactly what I just OD'd on Eudora Welty. Not just reading, but listening to every single one of the stories and the collected stories.
Yeah.
It took weeks. But what you just said is exactly, I think, what one would say about Eudora Welty. And I wonder if both of you would comment on this group of Southern Gothic writers and how you see them. Did they interact? I'm not sure whether they interacted, fed on each other, spoke about each other.
They knew about each other. I mean, she refers to Faulkner, but I don't think she refers. I mean, I'm trying to think of that essay. I reread that essay, the one I mentioned with the Southern Grotesque, and I think there was another one where she addressed the Georgia writers or something. I'm not sure. It's funny to think she wasn't really interested in a lot of society. I mean, she went to Yaddo once and did not want to go again. And in fact, she caused some hullabaloo there that I was trying to read about. She caused some problem. I mean, I think she turned somebody in for being a communist. I mean, it was something I don't know, I shouldn't say this at the library, talk to me afterward, we'll go to the bar. But there was something she was involved in some scandal there. And, but she, I know that even when famous writers came to town, she didn't necessarily want to see them. She wanted to read their works, and she didn't want to visit with them. So I think she felt that we are each other's colleagues on the page. I think that she felt collegial. I mean, you like to think, why do we have all these sort of British depictions of all kinds of famous people at dinners together? We should have at least a depiction of some kind. Somebody should do a sitcom that's all the Southern writers, the Southern writer. It could be called The Rural Juror, and it would be all the Southern writers getting together, and we could figure out what they would say to one another.
Yeah, but I mean, whether that really ever happened or not, it should be depicted. But I was saying, it's interesting. I think, when I was, also rereading some of her nonfiction, in writing short stories, the writer she brings up, sort of most prominently in that essay is Kafka. And that was for me. I mean, I think because I'm always, as a writer, and therefore also as a reader, kind of looking for the ways in which non-realistic fiction kind of works its way into the work of writers we think of as being so kind of devastatingly realistic. But that completely makes sense to me that O'Connor would be thinking about Kafka as, as an influence, as an example of how to write realistically about the day you wake up and it turns out that you're a cockroach, right? I don't know too much about her relationships with the other writers, but that was very striking to me that was who she thought about.
Because I happen to remember this quote, although she did say that for Kafka, she felt one only needs to read a little of Kafka. But she admired Kafka, but she also said he was like a ladder with the bottom rungs missing. And she really admired Conrad most of all. That really surprised me, that maybe he is kind of Old Testament-y, I mean, is she like the Old Testament? That's what I kept coming back to, that's, and sometimes people, there's reviewers, even recently, I found brand new reviews of Flannery O'Connor stories in Catholic magazines. And, one said, great, the season of, read in the season of Lent to show, the darkness of the human soul, and then there was one that said, don't read it, it's just awful, and, why must she show violence? And that made me wonder if he'd read the Old Testament. But she, she talks a little about the writers she loves, but not as much as you would think. I mean, did you find that? And maybe it doesn't appear as much in her letters.
Yeah, certainly, it's not an aspect of her work or her, or her writing that I'm particularly familiar with, I'm afraid. But she does seem as though, that she's so, before the presentation, I was talking to Anya about one thing I had wanted to work into my talk that I just wasn't quite able to, was O'Connor's rejection of her rejection, where she had submitted Wise Flood to a publisher, which I think was not. And they had come back and said, well, we might be interested if you're willing to make the following extensive revisions. And she wrote back and was like, no. This is an odd book, and if you want to publish a strange book, then you're welcome to do so, but I'm not going to make all these changes that you're suggesting, right? Because this is the book that I wrote, right? This is how I want it to be. And that kind of, that sort of independence of mind is so striking. That she was so kind of committed to her own work and her own vision, that she was willing to just be like, no, this is the book. So, obviously all writers have influence, but she really seemed like she knew what she wanted, and whatever other writers were doing, whatever editors were saying to her was less important than that.
I think we'll close with one last question.
experience of being raised in the South and being of the South, and something really came to me that I thought you guys might both discuss a little, which is as a Catholic, but in Wise Blood, the description is one of evangelical religion, at least largely. And just in terms of this very personal experience, this very, redemption was, brought over again and again in a way that would be recognizable to anybody who's spent time in that part of American culture. And yet, obviously the Catholic influence was enormous to her. And I wonder if either of you have thoughts on how she described this evangelical tradition as opposed to the tradition of Catholicism that she was part of.
Well, I can say that Flannery said that she was not a true Southern writer because she was a Catholic. She said that's the thing that stops her from truly being a Southern writer. And she didn't think much of the evangelicals. I mean, she had a quote in, she used another writer's work and said, well, there was some writer who wrote a book called The Rotting Hill, or maybe she made that up, I'm not sure, The Rotting Hill, and she said, people seem to assume that one writes about rot because one likes rot, when in fact, I might write about rot because I disapprove of rot. It was a very harsh thing she had to say, but I think that she wished these evangelicals would be pushed to the limit that would make them turn into Catholics. And it's funny, I don't mean to keep hitting the Catholic thing, but the more you read and the more you read about what she said is the work feels very, very different the more you read it. It feels more of a certain kind of Catholicism that I don't know if even that the Catholics as a group even accepted. But yeah, she really does want people to be redeemed and saved in this profound way. But she, as I recall, there are very few Catholic characters. The priest in The Displaced Person is one of the very few Catholics that appear in there. But I know that she is looking for that redemption, and maybe she's willing to see it in other places, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, what it seems to me, she's very critical of in the religion, in evangelical religion as she depicts it, is the idea of making a declaration of being renewed. The idea that you say, you're saved and then you're saved. And that, the stories in a way, while they're depicting people, and I'm thinking particularly of Wise Blood, that it's full of people saying, the various things about a transformation that has occurred in them. And that actually what the stories show, Wise Blood and also again and again in the short stories, is the way in which the characters need to be brought to a moment of experiencing their powerlessness in order to actually be transformed. And to me that feels very relevant, sort of not just to evangelicalism, but to our contemporary culture much more broadly. That we have this great desire to say that we have been transformed through, sort of consciously, deliberately, by deciding it. And she really doesn't buy that at all. I think that's a lot of what the stories are showing is the way in which that doesn't work, right? In which the epiphany is wrong, and it just, it's just not true.
Well, please join me and give our beautiful guests another round.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.